On a grand scale in Australia. This is nuts. The royal griefsters have sunk to a whole new level as they once again painted themselves as the most victimized people in the world.
The moment the cameras stopped rolling in Australia, something else began, and this time, nobody inside the royal commentary world was willing to stay polite. What unfolded wasn't just criticism. It was a full-scale dismantling of an image that had been carefully constructed for years. And the most explosive part? It didn't come from enemies. It came from voices who had once been measured. What happens when even the calmest royal observers start using words like indefensible and disgusting? And more importantly, why now? The Australian tour was supposed to be a reset moment for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. A controlled environment, a sympathetic stage, and a chance to reassert relevance through humanitarian optics.
Absolutely sickening, actually. I thought it was really, really disgusting, and I thought that Queen Elizabeth actually opened that hospital that Meghan was at many decades ago, and I thought it was disgraceful.
But instead of rebuilding credibility, it exposed something far more damaging, a system that many critics now claim is built not on service, but on simulation. And that's exactly where commentators like Tom Sykes and Paula began to shift the tone completely. Because what they saw wasn't a few bad decisions. They saw a pattern, a structure, a machine. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start with the moment that changed everything. Bondi Beach. Not just a location, but a site still carrying the emotional weight of a recent tragedy. A place where lives were lost, where grief was still fresh, and where any public appearance would naturally carry immense sensitivity. When Harry and Meghan arrived, the optics initially aligned with what people expect from royal-style engagements. Somber presence, quiet respect, carefully staged empathy. But then something happened that flipped the entire narrative. Within hours, literally hours, the outfit worn during that visit appeared online for sale.
Absolutely sickening, actually. I thought it was really, really disgusting, and I thought that Queen Elizabeth actually opened that hospital that Meghan was at many decades ago, and I thought it was disgraceful.
Not days later, not after a respectful gap, the same day, the same moment, the same images. And suddenly, the question wasn't about compassion anymore. It was about intent.
Trading clout for it. But she then went from the hospital to a homeless women's shelter where she once again showed her outfit, which is, it's insane to me, Tom. It's kind of like, hey, everyone, do you need to know what to wear to a children's hospital? Would you like to know what to wear to a homeless women's shelter and make money out of it? We've got you covered.
How do you reconcile a solemn visit to a tragedy site with a near-instant commercial tie-in? Can those two realities coexist without undermining each other? Or does one automatically cancel out the other in the eyes of the public? This is where Tom Sykes didn't hold back. He didn't frame it as a mistake. He framed it as a moral failure. And that distinction matters, because mistakes suggest misjudgment, but failure suggests something deeper, something systemic. And if you follow the structure of the tour, that system becomes impossible to ignore. Because Bondi Beach wasn't an isolated incident. It was the most extreme version of something that had already been happening throughout the trip. Hospital visit, refuge visit, veterans event. Each one followed the same sequence. Engagement, photography, immediate commercial linkage. The pattern was consistent enough that it no longer felt accidental. It felt designed. And that raises a much bigger question. One that goes beyond a single tour or a single controversy. At what point does humanitarian work stop being the purpose and start becoming the product? Because historically, the royal model has always been built on a very clear separation. Service on one side, commerce on the other. A line that Queen Elizabeth II herself warned should never be crossed. In fact, her position was explicit. If you want commercial freedom, you step away from institutional identity. You cannot have both operating simultaneously without consequences. And yet, What the Australian tour revealed is a model that attempts to merge them completely. Not occasionally, not subtly, but structurally. Charity generates imagery. Imagery drives attention. Attention fuels commerce. Commerce validates the model. And the cycle continues.
Of Queen Elizabeth II, when she said to them, look, mixing up public service and private commerce is going to end really badly, and we don't want you doing it for us. Thanks very much. We don't want you doing it for us.
So now the question becomes unavoidable. Is this evolution, or is it exploitation? Because even beyond the moral debate, there's another layer that critics like Paula pointed out very clearly. Control, or more accurately, the lack of it. Take the hospital visit, for example.
The Melbourne Royal Children's Hospital, where kids were wheeled out, staff was there, they wheeled out machines, and then Harry and Meghan proceeded to hug, kiss, cuddle, all without masks.
Children undergoing serious treatment were brought into a central space, arranged for visibility, and photographed in a way that raised immediate discomfort among observers. Whether or not Harry and Meghan directly requested that setup almost becomes irrelevant, because the responsibility of managing such environments ultimately falls on those leading the engagement. If you walk into a sensitive situation and allow it to become a staged visual moment, does it matter who initiated it? Or does responsibility come with presence? And this is where the comparison becomes unavoidable. Because when Queen Elizabeth II conducted similar visits, the approach was fundamentally different. Private, controlled, centered around the individuals, not the image. So what changed? Is this a modern media adaptation? Or is it something else entirely? Now here's where things get even more interesting. Because despite all the controversy, all the criticism, and all the visible backlash, the model didn't stop. In fact, it continued almost seamlessly. And that's what makes this situation more than just a public relations failure. It makes it a test of boundaries, a test of response, and most importantly, a test of the institution itself. Because while all of this was happening, one thing remained noticeably absent: action. King Charles III has the authority to intervene, to redefine the terms, to draw a new line if needed. But so far, that line hasn't been redrawn, and that silence is being interpreted in very different ways. Some see it as restraint, others see it as hesitation. But critics like Sykes see it as something more consequential, a gap. A space where this new model can continue to operate unchecked. And if that continues, what happens next? Because the Australian tour, as many observers have pointed out, may not have been the main event. It may have been a rehearsal, a blueprint, a proof of concept. And if that's true, then the real test is still ahead, when this same model moves closer to the center of the monarchy, closer to the institutions, closer to the legacy itself. And that's where Prince William enters the conversation. Because unlike Charles, William has been consistently described as someone who understands the long-term implications of symbolic erosion. Someone who sees not just the immediate controversy, but the cumulative effect of repeated boundary crossings. And according to those familiar with his thinking, he already knows what he would do. If you thought the backlash stopped at Bondi Beach, then the next layer of the story is where it becomes even more uncomfortable, because what looked like a single shocking moment suddenly starts to reveal a pattern that stretches across the entire tour. And once you see that pattern, it changes how every single event is interpreted. Because Bondi was not the beginning. It was the clearest example. So let's rewind slightly and look at what happened earlier, because this is where critics like Tom Sykes and Paula started connecting the dots in a way that completely shifted the narrative from bad optics to something far more deliberate. Before the beach, before the outrage, there was the hospital visit. And on the surface, it followed the familiar royal script that audiences have been conditioned to trust. Warm interactions, emotional engagement, vulnerable children, and carefully captured moments that are meant to symbolize compassion and connection. But here's where the tone begins to shift, because behind that polished surface, observers started noticing something that didn't quite sit right. Children receiving serious medical treatment were brought into a central space, arranged in a way that allowed for visibility, and photographed in a setting that looked less like a private moment of care and more like a controlled visual environment. And even if we accept the explanation that this arrangement was not directly requested, the bigger question still remains unavoidable. When you are operating in such a sensitive environment, is it enough to simply not request something, or does responsibility extend to what you allow to happen once you are there? Because this is exactly where the comparison with traditional royal conduct becomes impossible to ignore. When Queen Elizabeth II conducted similar visits, the emphasis was always on minimizing intrusion, protecting dignity, and ensuring that the moment served the individuals involved rather than the image being created. The photographs existed, but they were secondary, almost incidental, never the driving force behind how the engagement was structured. So now the question becomes sharper. Did this visit serve the children? Or did it serve the narrative? And just as people were beginning to ask that, something else happened that made the situation even harder to defend. The same day, the outfit worn during that hospital visit appeared on a commercial platform. Not as a subtle reference, not as a delayed feature, but as an immediate, clickable, monetized extension of the exact moment that had just been presented as humanitarian outreach. And suddenly, the pattern that was barely visible before starts to become undeniable. Engagement, photography, instant commercialization. And once that sequence repeats more than once, it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like strategy. Now pause for a second and really think about this, because this is where I want you to reflect as a viewer. If every act of public service is followed by a commercial opportunity tied directly to the same imagery, can those two intentions truly exist independently, or do they inevitably start to merge into a single objective? Because this is exactly the line that Queen Elizabeth II warned about years ago, when she made it clear that mixing institutional service with private profit would not just create tension, it would eventually erode the credibility of both. And what the Australian tour seems to demonstrate is not just that the line has been crossed, but that it has been replaced with an entirely new model. A model where the humanitarian element is no longer separate from the commercial structure, but actually functions as its foundation. And that's where Paula's criticism becomes particularly sharp, because she doesn't frame this as a moral debate alone, she frames it as a question of authenticity. Because when audiences begin to feel that what they are seeing is constructed primarily for output rather than intention, trust doesn't just weaken, it collapses. And that collapse doesn't happen loudly. It happens quietly, in the form of indifference, in the form of hesitation, in the form of people simply choosing not to engage. Which brings us to another critical part of this story that didn't receive as much dramatic attention as Bondi Beach, but may actually be even more revealing when you look at it closely. The retreat. Marketed as an exclusive, immersive experience, positioned within the broader narrative of the tour, and priced at a level that suggested high demand and limited access. The expectation that was created was not just about presence, it was about depth, about connection, about an experience that justified the premium attached to it. But what attendees actually received was something very different. A short appearance, a limited interaction, a structure that felt far removed from what had been implied. And suddenly, the same question appears again, just in a different form. When expectation and delivery no longer align, what does that say about the model behind it? Because this is where the commercial side of the operation starts to show cracks that the humanitarian side was initially masking. If the value being offered is not matching the price being charged, then the entire system begins to rely not on substance, but on perception. So now the tension isn't just about Harry and Meghan. It's about timing. Will the institution act before that shift of power happens? Or will it wait and allow the consequences to fully unfold first? Because if the Australian tour proved anything, it's this. The line that once separated service from strategy is no longer clearly visible. And once that line disappears, restoring it becomes much harder than protecting it ever was. So let me ask you something. Do you think this was just a series of bad decisions that spiraled out of control? Or are we looking at a deliberate model that's pushing boundaries to see how far it can go before someone finally steps in? And perception, as powerful as it is, has one major weakness. It fades when repeated exposure reveals the pattern behind it. So now we have multiple layers stacking on top of each other. A hospital visit that raises ethical questions. A commercial linkage that raises intent questions. A retreat that raises value questions. and a beach visit that brings all of it into a single, unavoidable moment that the public cannot ignore. And this is where the conversation starts to shift from individual actions to long-term consequences. Because the issue is no longer just about what happened in Australia. It's about what this represents moving forward. Because if this model continues, if this structure remains unchanged, then what happens when it is applied in environments that are closer to the core of the monarchy? What happens when the same approach is brought into the UK, where the institutional context is stronger, the public memory is deeper, and the scrutiny is far more intense? And more importantly, what happens to the distinction between official service and its imitation when both begin to look almost identical in execution, but completely different in intention? Because that distinction is not just symbolic. It is foundational. It is what allows the monarchy to function as something more than a public relations system. And once that distinction starts to blur, restoring it becomes exponentially more difficult. So now let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this before we move forward into what comes next. Do you believe that the public is reacting to isolated incidents that were handled poorly? Or are they starting to recognize a consistent model that is being repeated across different settings, each time becoming a little more visible, a little more controversial, and a little harder to defend? Because in the next part, we're going to step into what might be the most important phase of this entire story. The moment where this model potentially moves from an international test run into the very heart of the monarchy itself. And when that happens, everything changes. If you think the story reaches its peak with public backlash and uncomfortable optics, then what comes next is where the stakes quietly become much higher, because this is no longer just about how people reacted, it's about what happens when no one with real authority steps in to stop it. And that silence is exactly what critics like Tom Sykes are now focusing on, because in a situation this visible, in a moment this controversial, the absence of a response can be just as powerful as any action. So let's step into that tension, because this is where the narrative shifts from what Harry and Meghan did to what the monarchy is choosing not to do. After everything that unfolded during the Australian tour, the hospital questions, the retreat inconsistencies, the Bondi Beach controversy, there was an expectation, at least among observers, that some form of institutional clarification would follow. Not necessarily a dramatic intervention, not necessarily a public confrontation, but at minimum, a signal, a line, a boundary, something that says, this is where the separation exists. But that signal never came. And when King Charles III remains silent in moments like this, it creates a space that is far more significant than it appears on the surface, because in that space, the model we've been discussing doesn't just survive, it evolves. Now here's the question that starts to emerge, and it's one that people are increasingly asking behind the scenes. Is this silence strategic? Or is it reluctant? Because those are two very different things. If it's strategic, then it suggests that the monarchy believes this situation will eventually resolve itself, that public perception will correct the imbalance without the need for direct involvement, and that stepping in could potentially escalate the situation in ways that are more damaging than letting it play out. But if it's reluctance, then it suggests something far more complicated. It suggests that the cost of acting, personally, emotionally, institutionally, may currently feel higher than the cost of inaction. And this is where the dynamic between father and son becomes impossible to ignore, because at the center of this entire situation is not just an institution, but a family. King Charles III is not just a monarch evaluating a structural issue. He is a father looking at a son. And that distinction changes everything. Because every potential decision, whether it's redefining titles, drawing clearer boundaries, or publicly addressing the issue, comes with consequences that extend far beyond public perception. It touches relationships, it risks escalation, and perhaps most importantly, it opens the door to responses that the monarchy has already experienced in the past. Interviews, documentaries, books, and the question becomes almost uncomfortably direct. Is the institution holding back to avoid another wave? Because if that's the case, then what we're watching is not just a communication gap. It's a strategic pause shaped by past experience. But here's where the situation becomes even more complex, because while Charles may be choosing caution, there is another figure in this story who is watching the same events through a completely different lens. Prince William. And according to multiple observers who understand how he approaches institutional responsibility, William's perspective is not shaped primarily by emotion, but by long-term impact. Because where Charles sees a son, William sees a system. Where Charles sees the immediate consequences of action, William sees the cumulative consequences of inaction. And that difference is critical. Because the longer this model continues without resistance, the more normalized it becomes. The more familiar it looks. The harder it becomes to separate from the official structure it is operating alongside. And once that normalization reaches a certain point, reversing it is no longer a simple correction. It becomes a structural overhaul. So now the question evolves again, and this is where I want you to really think about the bigger picture. At what point does waiting become enabling? Because if no line is drawn after Bondi Beach, after the hospital concerns, after the repeated commercial overlaps, then what exactly would it take to trigger a response? And if the answer to that question is unclear, then what message does that send moving forward? Because here's the reality that critics like Tom Sykes are pointing toward. The Australian tour may not have been designed to succeed commercially. It may have been designed to succeed symbolically, to demonstrate that this model can operate independently, that it can generate global attention, that it can replicate the appearance of royal engagement without requiring institutional approval. And if that's true, then the absence of a response becomes part of the strategy. Because every time this model runs without interruption, it proves its own viability. And that brings us to what might be the most important shift in this entire story: the change in messaging. Because if you go back a few years, the narrative coming from Prince Harry and Meghan Markle was centered around grievance. The institution failed us. The system didn't support us. We had to leave. Then that narrative evolved into something else. We are building our own success. We are independent. We don't need the institution. But now, after Australia, the message appears to have shifted again. And this is where it becomes far more direct. We can operate in your space, with or without your permission. And that is a completely different kind of statement. Because it's not asking for reconciliation. It's not seeking approval. It's demonstrating capability. And once that capability is demonstrated, the dynamic between the institution and those operating outside it begins to change. Because now it's no longer about inclusion. It's about coexistence. And coexistence, in this context, comes with a very specific risk: confusion. Because if the public cannot clearly distinguish between what is official and what is not, then the value of being official begins to weaken. And that is exactly the concern that people around Prince William are believed to take seriously. Not the controversy itself, but the erosion of clarity. The gradual blending of two systems that were never meant to overlap. And once that blending reaches a certain point, the damage is not immediate. It's cumulative. It builds over time. Quietly. Almost invisibly. Until one day, the distinction that once defined the institution is no longer obvious. So now let me bring you into this moment, because this is where your perspective actually matters. Do you think the monarchy is playing a long game here, allowing public reaction to naturally set the boundaries? Or do you think this silence is creating a gap that is being actively filled by a model that is becoming more confident, more visible, and more difficult to challenge with each passing event? Because in the next part, we are going to move into what could be the turning point of this entire situation. The moment where this test run potentially shifts into something much closer to home. And when that happens, the questions we've been asking so far will no longer stay theoretical. If you've been watching this unfold thinking the Australian tour was the main story, then this is the moment where everything shifts. Because what we're really looking at now is not what happened there, but what that entire operation was quietly preparing for. And this is where the word dry run stops sounding like commentary and starts sounding like a warning. Because according to observers like Tom Sykes, the real significance of Australia isn't the backlash, the controversy, or even the commercial questions. It's the blueprint that came out of it, a fully tested model that can now be deployed somewhere far more sensitive. And that place is the United Kingdom. Now think about that for a second, because this is where the stakes escalate in a way that changes the entire conversation. In Australia, the distance from the core of the monarchy creates a buffer. The emotional connection is different, the institutional proximity is weaker, and the consequences, while visible, remain somewhat contained. But when the same structure moves into Britain, that buffer disappears completely. Suddenly, the same hospital visits are not happening thousands of miles away from royal institutions. They are happening in the same ecosystem. The same veterans are not part of a distant engagement. They are part of the very community that the monarchy directly represents. And the same imagery that once circulated internationally now overlaps directly with official royal activity in a way that becomes almost impossible for the public to distinguish. So here's the question that starts to matter more than anything else. What happens when imitation and institution begin to look identical, but operate on completely different principles? Because this is exactly the risk that people close to Prince William are believed to be watching very carefully. Not just the controversy, not just the headlines, but the gradual erosion of clarity. Because the monarchy, at its core, does not function purely on power or authority. It functions on perception, on symbolism, on the idea that what it represents is distinct, disciplined, and separate from commercial influence. And if that distinction begins to blur, then the damage isn't immediate. It's structural. It builds slowly, quietly, until the public no longer sees the difference between what is official and what is not. And once that happens, restoring that distinction becomes one of the most difficult challenges any institution can face. Now here's where things become even more uncomfortable, because the Australian tour didn't just test the model, it tested the reaction to the model. And what it found was something very specific. There was outrage. There was criticism. There were headlines. But there was no decisive intervention. No immediate boundary drawn. No clear signal that this approach would not be tolerated moving forward. And that outcome matters because in strategic terms, it sends a message. It says that the model can operate, generate attention, and even provoke controversy, without triggering a response strong enough to stop it. So now imagine what happens when that same model is applied in the UK, where the visibility is higher, the stakes are greater, and the potential impact on the institution is far more direct. Does it adapt? Does it intensify? Or does it push even further, precisely because it has already proven that the consequences are limited? And this is where the conversation starts to shift from analysis to inevitability. Because if nothing changes, then something else will. And that something is the environment in which this model operates. Because every time a royal-style engagement is replicated without official backing, every time imagery is produced that mirrors institutional service, every time the public is asked to interpret two nearly identical visuals with completely different intentions, the line that once defined the monarchy becomes harder to see. And once that line fades, the institution is no longer just competing with external criticism, it is competing with imitation. Now pause here, because this is where I want you to think about the long-term implications. If this continues for another year, 2 years, 5 years, what does the monarchy look like at that point? Does it remain a clearly defined institution with a unique role? Or does it become one version among several competing interpretations of what royal service looks like? Because that's the direction this is heading if no intervention occurs. And this is exactly why the role of Prince William becomes so central in this phase of the story. Because unlike Charles, who is navigating the situation with the weight of personal relationships and immediate consequences, William is looking at a future he will inherit. A structure he will be responsible for maintaining. A legacy that will define his reign. And from that perspective, the question is not whether this model is controversial. The question is whether it is sustainable for the institution to coexist with it. And based on everything that has been said by those who understand his approach, the answer to that question is likely very clear. But here's the catch. That answer cannot be implemented yet, because the authority to act still sits with King Charles III. And until that changes, the current strategy, whether it is intentional or reluctant, remains in place. So now we arrive at a moment of tension that is almost impossible to ignore. On one side, you have a model that is becoming more confident, more refined, and more willing to push boundaries. On the other side, you have an institution that is choosing, for now, to observe rather than intervene. And in the middle of those two forces is time. Because time, in this situation, is not neutral. It favors the side that continues to act. It favors the model that continues to evolve. It favors the system that continues to test limits without being stopped. So let me ask you something, because this is where your interpretation really shapes how you see everything that follows. Do you think the monarchy is deliberately waiting for the right moment to respond, allowing this situation to fully reveal itself before taking action? Or do you think that every moment of silence is giving this model more space to grow, more confidence to expand, and more legitimacy in the eyes of the public? Because in the final part, we're going to step into what could be the most decisive phase of this entire story. The point where this tension can no longer remain unresolved. And when that moment arrives, it won't just define Harry and Meghan's strategy. It will define the future direction of the monarchy itself. If everything we've explored so far feels like a slow build towards something bigger, then this is the moment where all of it converges. Because what happens next is not about analysis anymore, it's about decision, and decisions at this level don't just shape headlines, they shape history. Because whether people realize it or not, the Australian tour has already done its job. It tested the model. It exposed the reactions. It measured the limits. And most importantly, it revealed the gap. A gap between action and inaction. A gap between institution and imitation. A gap that now demands to be filled by someone with the authority to define where the line actually stands. And that brings us to the final, unavoidable question. Who is going to draw that line? Because up to this point, King Charles III has chosen a path that many interpret as restraint, a decision to prioritize stability over confrontation, to avoid escalating a situation that has already proven capable of generating global tension. But as we've seen, restraint in one direction often creates movement in another. And that movement has not slowed down. If anything, it has become more confident, more structured, and more willing to operate without waiting for approval. So now we're standing at a crossroads where two very different futures begin to take shape. In one future, the current approach continues, the silence holds, the model expands, and over time the distinction between official royal service and its independent imitation becomes increasingly difficult for the public to separate. Not because people are unaware, but because repetition normalizes what once felt unusual, and once something becomes familiar, it starts to feel acceptable. But in the other future, something shifts. A decision is made. A boundary is defined. And that definition doesn't just address what has already happened, it reshapes what is possible moving forward. And this is where Prince William becomes the central figure in the final phase of the story, because everything we've seen suggests that his perspective is not rooted in short-term optics, but in long-term preservation. He is not looking at a single tour. He is looking at a trajectory. A direction that, if left unchanged, could gradually alter the very foundation of what the monarchy represents. And that's why the conversation around him is so different. Because while others are debating what should happen, the understanding around William is that he has already decided what will happen, just not when. And timing, in this situation, is everything. Because acting too early risks escalation. But acting too late risks normalization. And once something becomes normalized, reversing it is no longer a correction, it becomes a conflict. So now the tension we've been building toward reaches its peak. Not between individuals. Not between narratives. But between two fundamentally different ways of defining what royal identity means in a modern world. Is it something that must remain protected, clearly separated from commercial influence, carefully structured to preserve its symbolic power? Or is it something that can evolve into a hybrid model, where visibility, engagement, and monetization coexist in ways that were once considered incompatible? Because that is the real debate underneath everything we've seen. And it's a debate that cannot remain unresolved for much longer. Now here's where I want you to pause and really think, because this is no longer just about Harry and Meghan, and it's no longer just about the monarchy. It's about how institutions adapt, or fail to adapt, when the boundaries that once defined them begin to shift. Do you believe that what we've seen is a necessary evolution, a reflection of a modern media landscape where visibility and influence are inseparable from commerce? Or do you believe that this is a line that, once crossed, fundamentally changes the meaning of service itself? Because whichever answer you lean toward, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. This story is not ending. It's transitioning from a phase of testing to a phase of consequence. And when those consequences begin to unfold, they will not just affect public perception, they will influence decisions at the highest level of the institution. Decisions about titles. Decisions about roles. Decisions about what is allowed to continue and what is not. And when those decisions finally arrive, they won't feel sudden. They will feel inevitable. The result of a chain of moments that started long before Australia, but became impossible to ignore because of it. So as we close this chapter, I want to leave you with one final thought. If the line has already been crossed, is the real question now whether it should be redrawn, or whether it still can be? Because that answer will define not just the future of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, but the future of the monarchy itself. And now I want to hear from you. Do you think the institution should step in and set clear boundaries, or should it continue allowing events to unfold naturally and let public perception decide the outcome? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is one of those moments where every perspective matters, and the discussion itself is part of the story. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to subscribe and stay with us, because the next phase of this story is already taking shape, and when it unfolds, you won't want to miss what comes next.